Hello, everybody. This is Roger Durling, Executive Director of the Santa Barbara International Film Festival, and I'm very excited to have with us director, writer, and producer Mimi deGruy to discuss her film Diving Deep, the Life and Times of Mike deGruy. And it was the opening night film 2 years ago at the Santa Barbara International Film Festival, and it was quite a magical homecoming for us and for Mimi and for our dear friend Mike deGruy. The Hollywood Reporter has written about Mimi's film that it succeeds as a touching personal reminiscence and as an understated but effective environmental manifesto. Before we start a conversation, let's take a little look, a little peek at Diving Deep.
The deep diving definitely worried me, but Mike was so excited about it. To ask him not to would be like asking him not to breathe.
Welcome, Mimi. So glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually want to start. I've seen this film so many times throughout the past years, and there was one scene when I was watching it last night again that it struck such a major chord for me. It's Mike talking about money and science, and that money is not being spent for science, and I'm misquoting him, but he says that if we don't pay attention to science, we're going to be doomed. And that moment just resonated. This film has always felt prescient to me, but last night watching it and hearing him with that quote felt even more prescient than ever. Have you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but have you found that since the past 2 years, that had this film, the themes, what Mike was saying, it remains so powerfully of the moment?
It does. I absolutely agree. But first, Roger, I really want to just interrupt this train of thought because I just want to thank you, first of all, for being such a supporter of Mike's, of mine, of taking this film and making it the opening night film. But more than that, I think for all of us in the community, everybody says people had to pivot during this pandemic. I was thinking about you, and it's like you didn't just pivot. You were doing some kind of Watusi dance, every few minutes you guys were changing and you were coming up with new ideas, and you pulled off a festival that was fun. I went to a couple of those screenings, the drive-ins, and it was just really fun to have everybody. Wow. Even if we were in our cars, we were honking our horns, and you're just really an advocate and a promoter of community, obviously around film. And I just think that is such an extraordinary thing. And your staff too is, of course, incredible.
Well, thank you. And, I have to say that, I think, for those who are listening, Mike and I were very close friends. And when I took over the film festival, Mike was a big champion and a big supporter and a big helper of everything. And he was very much about, let's do it. Let's take risk. As he was such a risk taker, and and don't be afraid. Let's just try different things. And I think that this past year, his voice was ringing in my ears, egging me to just take risks, and have fun and celebrate film as well. So thanks for your words, but let's go back to this idea of how prescient it is, and in particular that moment where he's angry and saying frustrated about science and how doomed we will be if we don't focus on science.
Well, I think he was prescient. I think he really tapped, but it wasn't really prescient as much as it was really present at that time, which is that, he recognized that we spend so much money to take resources from the earth, and we spend very little exploring, understanding by comparison, because I don't want to shortchange those people that are out there spending money and doing the work. But by comparison, we take a lot more than we give, and we certainly don't look at the science the way we should and could and should. That was 10 years ago that footage was shot, actually maybe even 11, and it's still very much true. And I think, I think the idea that we have this economy that has to keep growing and growing and growing and based on finite resources is just not sustainable. And we have an economy that's wrapped around making money for money's sake. And I think that all has to change. And I think he recognized it then in terms of the Gulf and science in general. And I do think, though, that what has happened in the past 10 years is there's grown this whole movement, particularly of the young, that really recognizes that we can't keep it going like it has been, that our economic model is not sustainable. So I'm very hopeful, and I think he would be really hopeful that there are a lot of people doing a lot of great work to sort of turn the ship. And I think certainly with this current administration, there's a lot more attention being paid to the science. They're bringing in some great people. There's some great work being done on blue economy, making the ocean really a part of all of the economic programs, and certainly, just trying to bring it back to the forefront of everybody's conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think your answer, I had that follow-up question, is that he has a little struggle with the deep water, which is very poignant, that he's almost disillusioned with what's happening. But your narrative remains very optimistic and very hopeful about the future. Is that something that was important for you to convey this message of hopefulness about it's not too late for us to make a change?
Well, I think the clock is ticking. I think everyone agrees, with climate change, we obviously have to slow down our carbon emissions, but we also have to backpedal and get rid of a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. So there's a lot to be done. I don't want to be falsely hopeful or optimistic, but I think there are all these kids that just aren't going to put up with the status quo. And I think they're also getting involved with, they're getting involved in all the elections. And I think they recognize, I hope, that democracy is theirs. And, the more involved they get with the issues and recognizing who's supporting the issues that they care about, that they have the power to vote those people out or in, depending. And I think, I think it's important to not be, I think there's a difference between optimistic and hope. And I think it's important to hang on to hope and use that as a motivator to galvanize people.
I love the quote from the Hollywood Reporter about the fact that your film becomes a personal reminiscence about Mike and a celebration of him as a person, but at the same time becomes an understated environmental manifesto. Is that something that it was important to you, that there was the personal story that drives through the narrative, but also that there was the message of the environment included in it?
I mean, I think that the overarching message, obviously, that I wanted to convey is that we're destroying that I felt Mike was really saying, is that we're destroying the ocean before we even know what's there. And that can be said about a lot of things on Earth, and so, but for me to really get that message or make that the most compelling message, I guess, I felt that they had to understand who Mike was and fall in love with him in a way. So it was important for me that we bring Mike's joy and his personality and his, his love of adventure, his love of the natural world, and hope that by feeling what Mike felt when he witnessed the oil spill, that then people would be motivated to kind of get involved.
Mm-hmm. When I first saw the film, and this was more than 2 years ago, and you were generous enough to share with me different versions of it. And I was very, of course, emotionally involved with the subject matter, and you as well. But this time around, when I was watching it last night, I was so admiring the structure of the script, in which, you know, we get to learn about Mike as a young person. We get to learn his passions, and then the deep water um, situation develops. How difficult was it for you to arrive to this very, very taut narrative?
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Well, I have to say, this is the perfect moment to say I had the most amazing team. Brett Sumner, the editor, you know, we went down so many different roads, and Shannon Dipvig, who was the co-producer, who'd been in the project pretty much since the beginning. You know, between those two, and then different friends viewing different cuts like you, I felt like we had a really, or I had a really great support team saying, this works, this doesn't work, but we tried an awful lot of different versions.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of ridiculous, actually.
And going back to, I mean, Mike tragically dies, and you have all this footage. And when did you decide that it was that you needed to put it all together into this film?
Well, I mean, I think when Mike died, we were, and it was more Mike than me, certainly, we were doing the oil spill project, but we also had a couple of other projects going. And everybody just kept saying, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Especially around the oil spill. And I just didn't feel that that was right. It didn't feel right to me. I felt like there was something else. And I just had to sit with it and go through all this footage. And just, and honestly, part of going through all that footage was part of my grieving process, I would say, because I felt like it was a luxury, really, because I was able to hang out with him, you know, for months, years,
Mm.
in the edit room. And so, gosh, I've just lost what your question was.
No, it's when did you understand that that all this footage could actually be made into a movie? How soon after his death? And
Yeah, so it was pretty early on that I knew that I wanted to make a film, but that the arc would be Mike's life rather than just making a film about the oil spill. It was, I mean, pretty soon, probably 8 months after he died. Yeah.
mhm.
And
And
really just going into the edit room, as I said in the film, you know, and going through all this stuff, and then finding that one piece of footage that I just kept going back because he was so impassioned and so angry. And I felt like that piece really kind of encapsulated his rage, really.
that is something that you hadn't seen. I mean, you hadn't seen that in him up until you came across that footage, the anger and the frustration that he had.
Oh no, I mean, I saw it when the oil was when it first happened. I mean, right away he was distraught, you know. And I saw it, but I hadn't seen it on film until that moment. I mean, he was really, 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 really upset, and he was not only upset, he was depressed, he was demoralized. Um, he was really depressed, actually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan for many reasons of this film, and I love the way you open the film. I find it more poignant now than when I first saw it. The deep dive, which leads to the title, but the deep dive that he takes, and I think that he says, you know, you said something about the descent being alone, and he goes into darkness. When did you zero in on that sequence to be your opening of the film?
Gosh, I feel like I should talk to Brent. I should have had Brent on here with me. I think, actually we did a montage first, and then that felt very, and not to denigrate TV, because I've certainly watched a lot of it in the pandemic, and I've seen a lot of amazing television. But it just felt it didn't feel really cinematic. And I think we realized we wanted to start with something that just grabbed people right away. And it was our hope that, showing that deep suit, that deep diving suit, the gym suit. No, I can't remember what that suit is called. There's a gym suit, and that was whatever the nude suit is. I think it was my hope that that would grab people's attention right away, and just hold them for a minute, and then we get into who he was.
No, but it's very lyrical, it's very poetic and very moving. Even 2 years after seeing the film, as I said, it's very impactful. How did you have a knack for getting the talking heads, ranging from David Attenborough to Sylvia Earle to James Cameron, to give wonderful nuggets about Mike. How is that something that what you wanted to hear about them, that you expected, that it was, you wanted certain things to be said to them, or it was completely spontaneous and it was a discovery?
Well, I would say the latter. I mean, first of all, I think they all really loved Mike, and were very generous with their time. I have to say, my interview with David was really long, and I was a little embarrassed when we ended, because I realized that was probably longer than he usually gives. They all really loved Mike, so they were speaking from their hearts, and he was close to each one of those three. And so that was a true advantage. And I think in all of those cases, each of the things, I'm not sure which you're referring to, but were surprises. And yeah, I don't think, it's hard to remember because it was a while ago. I don't think I really led them any particular direction. I mean, there may have been gentle leading, but I certainly didn't give them any words.
I mean, like there is a coincidence that all of them use the term stubborn to describe, and
Yeah.
to describe Mike. They have different ways to tell us how they happen to describe them so well, like James Cameron talking about, he spoke two languages, English, and he spoke with his hands. And
that was totally him. That made me laugh so hard when he said that. That was great. No.
Which, speaking of, we have a little clip of James Cameron talking about Mike. So let's take a look at that and we'll continue talking.
I think you could say that, going into the deep ocean is more of a spiritual interior journey, and going out into the universe is more of a dualism between the feminine and masculine spirit. We conquer space. You don't conquer the ocean. You understand the ocean. You become intimate with the ocean. You let it teach you.
Mimi, another great thing about the doc is that yes, we learn about his exploration, but then you're pretty frank about your relationship with him. And I think that this scene leads to you talking about the fact that here's a man that it was such a deep explorer, but had a hard time exploring his own emotions and relationships. Was that difficult for you to navigate that, pun intended?
Well, I think I realized, actually I did. I realized early on that the parallel storyline for me was that, I think I felt that Mike and I hadn't explored the depths of our relationship to the extent that I wish we had. I mean, I'm sure most people who go through a sudden death with someone they love has that feeling to some degree or another. Sorry for pun, degree, but I did have it a lot. And then so there was that parallel storyline with, we don't explore those relationships that we value the most, and then they're gone. well, here is the ocean, which we're not exploring, and it could very well be gone as we know it soon. So I think I saw those two as parallel storylines that I could weave together. And Jim, that comment that he made, when he said that, I just felt like we could just stop rolling right then and there, because I loved that moment that I just loved that moment. I thought it was powerful and really moving what he
Mhm.
said.
You mentioned Brent, and the editing is pretty terrific. How long was the editing process? And they're really interesting, and interesting in a very effective way. Like you have the entire Antarctica sequence. Um, um, you cross cut to the birth of Frances, your daughter. Can you talk about those things, of how long the editing process take, and about working those contrasts that you visually show us?
Well, it was a long process, and I think, gosh, I can't even remember the number of months, to be honest, Roger. I think it just was long, and again, it was kind of fun to play with different storylines. I felt that going into the caves in Antarctica, the underwater caves, there was like this kind of, again, a parallel to, a child being, inside of a mom. I mean, that deep water cave was sort of womb like, and so, and that was when I was pregnant with Francis, actually. I mean, with Max.
Mhm.
So it was a really, really tricky time. I mean, my mom came out and stayed with me, and it was her job. She's like, I am not letting you have this baby before Mike comes back from Antarctica. So, I think we did sequence after sequence, and then, you know how it works. I mean, you do the whole timeline, but then you just keep fidgeting and whatever, just working different sequences at different times. So yeah, Brent was endlessly patient, endlessly. It was great.
And one of the most powerful sequences is the killer whale,
Mhm.
and the killer zone. And I guess that was the first time that David Attenborough and him had worked together in 1990, correct?
I guess
Uh,
it was. I'd forgotten that because, yeah, David said that. Yeah.
yeah, let's actually take a look at the not the Antarctica, Patagonia killer whale sequence.
And the fins got closer and closer. And I remember at one point, I motioned to Mike and said, look behind us. And we turned around, and the sea lions are all over the beach, like looking at us. I could just see it in their eyes. They're like, get out of the water. Are you crazy? Do you see what's coming?
Being on snorkel, being in the killing zone with a camera in your hands, and there's a fin 6 feet tall coming through the water, and every primitive instinct you have is screaming, get out of the water. While all that's going on in the back of my head, I'm hearing Mike and Paul saying, row, 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 row.
You also bring up, and it's part of that sequence, that Mike had this, I'm quoting what the Hollywood Reporter said, that he had an excessive lust for danger. What do you think that was about? His fascination with taking these risks in his life.
Well, I have really mixed feelings about that, obviously, on a number of levels. I mean, part of me, we talked about it a lot. I think I will say I always felt enormous faith in his ability to judge a situation and handle it. I mean, and I think in that particular situation, he watched the sea lion pups, or seal pups. I think there might have been both sea
Yeah,
lion seals. I
yeah.
think they were both. They watched him for weeks, and as they say in the film, they made a calculated choice, and that was true in almost all those situations that seemed to be excessively violent or dangerous, risky. not violent. So I really actually had a lot of faith in his ability to navigate those kinds of situations. So it's just it's so strange that he died in the air. I think and in a situation that you know. So I think what drove him in those situations was he was really determined to share what he was experiencing and seeing. And he was willing to go to lengths that probably most people wouldn't in order to do that. And he would study the situation, he would, and then make the calculated decision when and how to do it. But I think what that arose out of was this love of the natural world and this hunger to share it with people. So I think at the end of the day, so they would respond more sensitively, and he wanted to entertain, no question about it. But yeah.
There are really poignant moments with your two children, with Max and with Francis. How were those interviewing them and listening them talk about Mike? Was that a difficult task to be behind the camera during those moments?
Well, I think it was difficult for them, and I'm hugely grateful to them that they were willing to talk so openly. And yes, it was really hard. It was really hard. Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not going to pry, but I mean, was it, you mentioned earlier that doing this process was very cathartic for you. Was it helpful for the two of them?
The process of doing it, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. But Francis did say something to me recently that it was the most gratifying thing I think she could say. And she was 15 and was just starting a new school months after he died, and then of course went to college. So all of those friends at her new school and at college never met Mike. And she shared it with a bunch of friends in school and college. And she called me and she said, the most powerful thing for me is that I feel like now my friends know my dad. And I just was like, okay, that's why I did it. Maybe, it just was so, it's really gratifying, really moving for me.
And what would you say it's Mike's legacy ultimately? And do you still see his influence, his impact being felt?
People do continue to say to me that Mike affected them in this way or the other. He certainly was a very charismatic and enthusiastic guy. And I think if the film helps to promote his love of the ocean and his hope that people would want to find out more and would encourage policy that protects the ocean and perhaps gets us off fossil fuels so that we're not drilling in the deep water so much. I think if this film helps push those hopes of Mike's forward, then maybe that's a legacy. But I think more than that, I think people just remember his outsized charisma and enthusiasm. I think, and he took that wherever he went, whether it was just talking to people. He really made people feel like they were the only ones in the room. He just was a very present person.
Yeah. I think somebody mentions, I think it's Sylvia Earle says, he had a generosity of spirit. And that was definitely the case. I mean, as you know, he's been so influential to us here at the festival, and we have this whole educational program, Mike's Field Trip to the Movies, named after him, that he created, and it has a life of its own. So it's pretty. Yeah. His impact continues. So tell us, opening night. It started the Santa Barbara Film Festival. great review from the Hollywood Reporter. What has been going on? I mean, of course, the pandemic came in and sort of slowed things down, but you've been through quite a lot of film festivals with the film. Tell us what was that been like?
Well, that's been interesting. I mean, yeah, it's so much fun to share the film in a live audience and have people, you know how it is, people laugh, they cry, you can feel the range of emotions in a theater with people. So I love that part of the film festival process. But so we premiered in January 2019, and
Yes.
and then started the film festival process a couple of months later, 4 or 5 months later. And that continued through the fall till the winter of 2020. And then obviously had to come to a screeching halt. So there have been a few virtual festivals or virtual things. Those are great. I mean, anyway, people can see the film, and then it's good, but it's not like having a live audience or being with people. And then, yeah, so we missed a lot of things. I think I was telling you before, I was supposed to go to Germany for the opening of the International Ocean Film Tour. It was one of 3, I think, of its linchpin films, and couldn't go to that. Couldn't go to Australia, where we had a theatrical release. But I'm just grateful that it's out there now, and yeah. So hopefully,
Well, but the screenings that we had here in Santa Barbara, he was a hometown hero. Everybody, a lot of people know you, and people adored him. So the film had an opening night. I mean, it's definitely will be one of the most memorable opening nights we've had because of those reasons. I was just curious. The film has a universal appeal, even if you didn't know Mike. What has been your experience sharing the film with other audiences?
Well, it is interesting because, well, first of all, premiering the film at the film festival on opening night was a night my kids and I will never ever forget, and are so grateful that that you chose the film to open the festival. It was great. I mean, it was to have the whole team up there with us, and yeah, it was very moving and felt really right. And I was very, very, very grateful. I think I've heard from people, someone online put it in a review. I didn't know who he was, hadn't heard of him, but then I saw this footage and I can't believe, I don't know, they seemed very moved. I don't know, can't remember exactly what they said. But then a guy, I did a podcast, and one of the interviewers said, I didn't know Mike's work, but I did know Mike's work. He said, I knew all of those sequences. And he said, that's the most powerful thing, is that Mike really put the work first, and he wasn't, he wasn't out there looking for attention for those particular films or those sequences, and yet everyone knew those films and sequences. So his point was, that's just a really unusual thing in this day and age. And that's true. He really was on to the next thing rather than kind of trotting it around. And it was also before social media. So, it wasn't that easy to do.
A couple of last 2 questions. One is his death sequence, the shot of your house, you getting the call, were those difficult sequences to put in and have to relive?
Yeah, I suppose they were. I think, though, when you get into the mechanics of making a film, I had to remove myself at different points emotionally because it was too overwhelming and too hard. But I knew I had to explain how he died at some level, and so I tried to go to a place where it would feel real to the audience, my emotion. But it's funny because you and I talked about Agnes Varda, and and her film about her late husband. And
Mhm.
she was so brave. I'm not that brave. I thought her film was so powerful. And I was removed in a way. I mean, I tried to give as much of myself as I knew how to do, but I was also really preoccupied with story structure and, trying to do this portrait of Mike. So um, it was hard, but I don't think it was as hard as maybe I should have. I mean, I could have done more, you
Oh,
know?
I think it it's the emotion is there. It's very moving. The way, which actually, I think you and I have discussed this in offline, is the idea of inserting yourself in the story. How difficult was that for you? The decision of you being the narrator, you being inserting yourself in the story.
That was horrible. I mean, it took me a really long time to acknowledge that that would be a vehicle through which, or I would be the vehicle through which we could tell the story. That does not come naturally to me. And yeah, that part was hard. And again, looking at Agnes Varda, it's like, wow, she got in there. And it was hard. Yeah, really hard. I think it's really hard.
Yeah, I don't think it was easy for her either.
I'm sure it wasn't.
Because yeah, but I think I think that's part of the bravery, which you're lower rating yourself. I mean, there is bravery in the story, and it comes through both from Mike and yourself as well. Last question, lighter one. Christopher Cross does the closing song, and it's very specific about Mike and you and your family. And how did it come about getting Christopher Cross to write the song about diving
Thank you
deep?
so much for asking that question, Roger, because so Chris and Mike met each other, I don't know how long ago. Chris and his ex-wife, Jan, who remains a good friend of mine. They both are good friends of mine. They all met each other on a dive trip somewhere, or in Hawaii, maybe. Anyway, they just were good friends to us when we moved to Santa Barbara, and remained good friends. And so Stephen Barber, who organized all the music, he is in Austin and a great old friend of Christopher's. And Stephen would play keyboards for Chris, and he, I guess, asked Chris if he'd be interested in writing a song. And so Chris did. And when I got it, my jaw just dropped. And it's been a tricky thing because I feel like it hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves, because, when the movie ends, people typically get up and either leave the theater, or, you don't really listen to that closing song necessarily. But it's so powerful. And he was so generous to do that. So generous. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very moving to listen to it, and as I said, it's so specific to the film and to you and to your family, and it's lovely. It's lovely, lovely. So for those who are listening to this and haven't seen the film, or are curious to see it, how can people see Diving Deep?
Well, it's out. You can rent it or buy it on Amazon, Apple, iTunes, Apple. Oh gosh, there's a whole list of them. Roku, YouTube. But those are the ones that come to my mind. If you go to divingdeepmovie.com, you can also see the different places where it's streaming.
To the website. Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Well, Mimi, it's always a pleasure. I love you to pieces. And,
I feel the same about you, Roger. Thank you.
And you know how much I love Mike. So
I know, and I love seeing his picture right behind you. He's been over your shoulder smiling at me. It's great.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for doing this, and I will see you soon. Big hug.
All right, big hug. Love you.
Okay.